attention to these experiences.
We are going to play
The
on
CIA's
roller
involvement in
skate.
consciousness studies wasn't limited to philosophical curiosity, it was strategic. Projects like Stargate
Listen
and
to
others under
Eternal
the
Inlet.
umbrella of the CIA Gateway process were designed to explore psychic phenomena for practical use, remote viewing, extrasensory perception, even mental influence. These weren't fringe experiments, they were funded, documented, and in some cases yielded results that were too consistent to ignore. While none of these declassified files explicitly mention the 49-day transition, they show a clear institutional interest in the kind of consciousness that doesn't obey physical limits. Now enter Valerie V. Hunt, a lesser-known but pioneering researcher in the field of human energy systems. Her book Infinite Mind, Science of the Human Vibrations of Consciousness blends scientific observation with concepts that most would call metaphysical. Hunt argued that the human energy field, or aura, is not just symbolic, it's measurable, dynamic, and holds memory and awareness beyond the confines of the brain. In her view, death doesn't extinguish the consciousness field, it liberates it. She even documented shifts in frequency that align with what many near-death experiencers report, feeling weightlessness, unity, light, and a sense of timelessness. That might sound spiritual, but it also pushes into the realm of parapsychology, a field that has long explored how the mind interacts with forces we can't yet measure or explain. Telepathy, precognition, and remote viewing all suggest that consciousness isn't tied down to the brain. And if it's not, then death becomes less of a wall and more of a crossing point. Cornel West once said that the way we talk about death reflects the kind of society we live in. If a society avoids it, suppresses it, or fears it, what does that say about its deeper values? Could it be that by keeping conversations about consciousness after death on the fringe, certain structures of power are being maintained? After all, fear is a potent tool,
Yours to command. I go
but knowledge, especially of our own eternal nature, can be liberating. So when we pull all of this together, NDE, CIA consciousness projects, subtle energy research, and philosophical reflections, it's not just a patchwork of strange ideas. It starts to look like a mosaic, one where every piece adds weight to the idea that the soul's journey continues, consciously, after the body stops. And that somewhere in the mix of ancient teachings and secret agency files, a deeper truth about human existence is quietly waiting to be fully understood. Reincarnation, karma, and the 49-day interval. If consciousness does persist after death, then what happens next? Do we dissolve into nothingness, float through infinite space, or begin again in a new body, carrying echoes of a former life? Across cultures, the idea of reincarnation isn't just a poetic metaphor. It's a structured explanation for the soul's continuity. And the 49-day interval, central to Tibetan Bardo teachings, isn't just symbolic. It's seen as a karmically charged window of opportunity and consequence. Let's start with evidence, yes. Actual case studies.
You'll risk injury if you come
Dr.
any
Ian
closer, my
Stevenson,
misguided friend.
a professor of psychiatry at the University of Virginia, documented over 2,500 cases of children who claimed to remember past lives. These weren't vague stories, they included names, dates, geographic locations, and personal details verified by independent investigators. In many of these cases, the time span between the death of the previous individual and the birth of the child hovered around several weeks, often close to the 49-day mark. Coincidence? Maybe. But when thousands of such cases accumulate, patterns start to speak louder than speculation. Then there's Brian Weiss, a psychiatrist trained in Western medicine, who stumbled upon reincarnation through therapeutic regression. In sessions meant to uncover early life trauma, patients began recounting past lives complete with historical details they shouldn't have known. While critics often brush this off as memory confabulation, Weiss found that these regressions had healing effects. Chronic phobias disappeared, emotional blocks softened, and in some cases physical symptoms eased.
one I'm altogether
This overlap of therapy and metaphysics implies that something more than imagination might be at work.
Sometimes one must put aside
The Bardo teachings offer an elegant explanation. During the 49 days following death,
a new
the soul is said to pass through different realms, each shaped by the karma of previous actions. If liberation isn't attained, consciousness gravitates toward a new birth that mirrors its unresolved energies and desires. This karmic momentum, both attraction and consequence, directs the next incarnation. It's a process not of judgment, but of energetic resonance. And the soul isn't passive in this. Tibetan texts suggest that during this liminal phase, the soul is aware, choosing, navigating, sometimes guided by light, sometimes clouded by fear. This brings us to Simone de Beauvoir, one of the great existential thinkers of the 20th century. She argued that with freedom comes responsibility, and that our choices shape our essence. If we extend this logic beyond the grave, we're left with a profound ethical implication. If consciousness continues, so does moral accountability. Karma then isn't a cosmic reward system, it's a natural extension of our freedom to choose. Death, instead of wiping the slate clean, becomes a mirror, and the Bardo, a place of reckoning. To ground this exploration in ancient documentation, consider the British Museum's edition of Journey Through the Afterlife, Ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead. This remarkable publication reveals how the Egyptians, like the Tibetans, believed the soul underwent a post-death journey, navigating tests, encounters, and spiritual gateways before it could attain peace or rebirth. In both traditions, the soul's progression isn't automatic, it's earned, guided by virtue, intent, and awareness. So now the 49-day window isn't just a curious artifact of religious belief. It becomes a structured phase, a metaphysical intermission, where the echoes of one life shape the entry into another. And if that's true, then how we live matters far more than we think. Because death isn't the end of the story, it's a turning page in a much longer book, written by the choices we make with every breath.
Sire?
Holographic universe theories, illusions, and reality checks. What if everything we think is real is just a projection, a kind of grand, immersive illusion? That's the unsettling question at the heart of holographic universe theories. These ideas suggest that what we experience as physical reality might actually be a three-dimensional rendering from a two-dimensional source. But this isn't just abstract physics, it has enormous implications for the nature of consciousness, and more specifically, for what happens when the physical body dies. The holographic principle emerged from quantum gravity research, where physicists discovered that the information contained within a volume of space could be encoded on its boundary. It's like everything inside a room could be written on the walls information-wise.
Something amiss?
This model makes some physicists consider the idea that the universe itself may be holographic. But if the world is a projection, then so is the body. And if the body is a projection, consciousness might not be in the body at all, it might be receiving, processing, or interacting with it, like a user with a virtual headset. Jean-Paul Sartre, in his exploration of existential consciousness, emphasized that human perception doesn't merely reflect the world, it constructs it. His work pointed toward the possibility that consciousness actively shapes our experience of reality. And when the sensory inputs of the body shut down in death, the question arises, does consciousness simply stop? Or does it shift to constructing a new kind of experience, perhaps one that's not constrained by the rules of material physics? Friedrich Nietzsche pushed this even further. He insisted that truths are often illusions we've forgotten are illusions. For Nietzsche, unmasking these illusions was a path to deeper wisdom. Could it be that death unmasks the grandest illusion of all, the belief that consciousness ends when the body decays? Here's where spiritual insight and science begin to intertwine. Author Paul Brunton, in his lesser-known but powerfully resonant work, The Hidden Teaching Beyond Yoga, describes a layered reality, one in which the world we see is just the surface of a far deeper metaphysical structure. He suggests that through disciplined inner practice, One can break through the illusion of form and discover that awareness is independent, even sovereign. He writes not from abstract theory, but from experience describing states of consciousness where the illusion of separation between self and reality dissolves completely. This ties directly back to Tibetan Bardo teachings, which describe the post-death state as one where illusions fall away. The soul sees not with eyes, but with awareness. It encounters projections of its own mind lights, sounds, forms, each representing states of being. Without a body, there is nothing to filter reality. There is only raw perception, and according to the teachings, this perception can either bind or liberate. Neil Donald Walsh, in his writings on co-creation, proposes that we are constantly shaping reality with our thoughts and beliefs. That doesn't stop at death. If reality is partly created by consciousness, then death is just a shift in creative domain from shaping the outer world through action into shaping inner realms through awareness. The Bardo, then, is not merely a waiting room. It's an active, dynamic field where the soul's next step is written in the language of vibration, intention, and karmic inertia. So, what if death is not an end but a change in the mode of perception? What if the collapse of physical form is simply the removal of a screen, revealing the true source of the projection? This is more than a speculative question. It could redefine our relationship with fear, with identity, and with the choices we make.
I welcome you.
Because if this life is an illusion, it doesn't mean it's meaningless. It means it's meaningful in a much bigger way, one that might stretch far beyond this realm, into the next. Postmodern skepticism and the future of death studies. If we've built our understanding of death on a fragile narrative, what happens when that narrative is questioned?
The gods are unforgiving.
That's where postmodern thought enters, pulling at the seams of fixed meanings, shaking up what we think we know, and forcing us to re-examine even the most sacred assumptions, including, and especially, the assumption that death is the final stop. Judith Butler, a central figure in postmodern philosophy, argued that identity itself is not fixed but constructed, shaped by language, power, and cultural context. Apply that to death, and you begin to see that even the idea of a definite end might be a social construct. If we are told over and over that death equals nothingness, it becomes internalized as truth, even if there's no absolute evidence to support that. Butler's lens opens up the possibility that our collective understanding of death may be less about truth and more about narrative control. And Hannah Arendt, another postmodern thinker with sharp political insight, reminds us that institutions often control public consciousness by shaping the stories we're allowed to believe. In her analysis of power, Arendt noted how systems rely on simplifying reality into digestible, controllable frames. Could it be that the dominant story, death as extinction, is one such frame? If consciousness were proven to continue after death, it would challenge medical science, religious institutions, and even political systems that rely on fear and finality. Now here's the twist. While postmodernism peers down grand narratives, the emerging field of consciousness studies is quietly building something new in their place. Within philosophy of science, researchers are starting to examine the limits of reductionism. Can all human experience really be explained by neurons and brain chemistry? Or is there more? These questions are no longer dismissed as fringe. Conferences are held, journals published, an interdisciplinary dialogue is forming around what used to be taboo, the nature of awareness itself. The CIA's gateway process doesn't spell out a 49-day transition, but it did explore altered states, astral projection, and out-of-body consciousness in ways that show just how seriously institutions took these possibilities. They didn't do it out of spiritual interest, they did it for strategic advantage. But what's important is that these concepts were once classified, and when knowledge is hidden, it often means it's powerful. To expand this thread further, let's bring in the Nag Hammadi scriptures, a collection of Gnostic texts discovered in Egypt in 1945. These writings, long excluded from mainstream Christianity, describe the soul as being trapped in illusion, and ignorance, cycling through material realms until it remembers its divine origin. The similarities to the Bardo state are striking. Both speak of a post-death phase filled with choice, light, temptation, and liberation.
I've been thinking of the time
Both offer a spiritual roadmap for navigating the unseen.
and I have found nothing redeeming.
These ancient scriptures don't just offer an alternative theology, they challenge the core idea that death is passive. In both Gnostic and Tibetan traditions, the after-death state is participatory. The soul chooses, navigates, even struggles.
You mongrel.
It's not an ending, but a hyper-aware process of becoming. As academic interest in these topics grows, we may be on the brink of redefining death not as annihilation, but as transition. The future of death studies will not be a single narrative, but a mosaic of scientific inquiry, ancient wisdom, and philosophical questioning. And the more we truly ask, the closer we might come to understanding that the 49-day soul journey is not just an ancient myth or speculative curiosity. It might be one of the most important and most suppressed truths of human existence. Connecting the dots.
Live by the sword.
So here we are,
Live a good
at the
life.
edge of a question that might just change everything. What if consciousness doesn't end when the heart stops? What if death is not a full stop, but a comma, a pause in the sentence of our existence before the next phrase begins? Whether we consider the 49-day soul journey through the lens of Tibetan Bardo teachings, intelligence agency secrets, consciousness studies,
Hello again.
or ancient philosophical insights, one thing becomes increasingly difficult to dismiss: the idea that something persists,
For justice.
something observes, something chooses. We've explored how the body might be just a temporary vessel, how the mind could be more than the brain, and how death might unlock not silence, but transformation. From Carl Jung's collective unconscious to quantum mind theories, from Sufi mysticism to CIA gateway process documents, from postmodern skepticism to subtle energy studies. Each point we visited suggested a larger pattern, and at the center of it is consciousness uncharted, unconfined, and possibly eternal. Now, does this mean every spiritual text or classified file has the final word? Not at all. And that's precisely where balance is crucial. Some claims are exaggerated, some documents are misinterpreted, but within the noise lies a frequency of truth, a resonance that keeps repeating across time, space, and culture. At the end of life might be the beginning of awareness on a new level. The Bardo, the 49-day interval, becomes a metaphor, a model, or perhaps even a literal process depending on your view. But more than anything, it's an invitation. And what are we being invited to do? And to awaken. To live with the awareness that this life isn't all there is. That our actions, thoughts, and intentions ripple beyond the physical. That ethical choices don't just matter socially, they might shape our trajectory across dimensions. The fear of death has long been a tool used by systems, institutions, and even our own egos to keep us confined. But when that fear dissolves, what's left is liberation, a kind of personal sovereignty. And as Noam Chomsky has argued in a different but related context, the most powerful act we can take is to become critically aware of the narratives we inherit and to consciously choose the ones we live by. So maybe it's time to stop asking, what happens when I die? And start asking, what kind of awareness will I carry into what comes next? That one shift in perspective can change how we treat each other, how we handle suffering, how we build communities, and how we face the unknown. If you've made it this far in the exploration, maybe you already sense it. This isn't just information, it's transformation. It's a subtle nudge to look beyond appearances, to investigate for yourself, and to lean into the mystery with both curiosity and courage.
I shall do everything to prove
And that's the real journey. Not just the one that comes after death, but the one that begins right now with a single question. What if the truth isn't hidden at all, but waiting patiently, in the silence between breaths, for us to finally remember?
As I have said before, you could not have made a better choice.
Yes? I am willing.
None shall
Basic
see.
physical death. And that means that this tuning device that we have called physical body doesn't work anymore. So we have to phase out of it. And we're completely out of phase, and this doesn't work, so we are totally there. Again, our consciousness is not dependent on this. It's over there. And being over there is, again, a reality.
Have you ever wondered what really happens after we die, not just in theory or faith, but in terms that blend ancient wisdom with modern science? Imagine finding out that the same question one that monks in Himalayan monasteries have explored for centuries was also quietly investigated by intelligence agencies. That's right. We're talking about a strange intersection between Tibetan Bardo teachings and declassified CIA documents. Sounds wild, doesn't it? The idea that death might not be the end has always fascinated humanity. Across cultures, timelines, and religions, people have been asking, does consciousness survive after physical death? Is there a journey beyond the body? Tibetan Buddhism offers a bold and specific claim. For 49 days, the soul, or more accurately, the stream of consciousness navigates a transitional state called the bardo. During this time, it can either attain liberation, move toward reincarnation, or become entangled in its karmic patterns. It's precise. It's detailed. And here's the twist, it's not just spiritual talk. There's a whole wave of modern interest that surprisingly aligns with this idea, including the CIA's infamous Gateway Process documents. Now, before we leap to conclusions, let's clarify something important. There isn't a single smoking gun CIA document that says the soul travels for 49 days after death. That would be too easy. What we do have is a convergence of classified research into consciousness, out-of-body experiences, remote viewing, and altered states of awareness. We also have thousands of years of metaphysical insight from Eastern traditions and a long line of Western philosophers pondering what it means to be conscious. And over time, these threads have tangled together, sometimes accurately, sometimes speculatively, into a narrative that suggests our awareness might continue, even when the body shuts down. This video explores that tangled, fascinating space. We'll look at how metaphysics, spirituality, and philosophy of mind all contribute to a growing conversation around the 49-day soul journey. We'll ask big questions, but keep things clear and grounded. We'll compare ancient wisdom traditions with near-death experiences, and even touch on why intelligence agency secrets have included an interest in post-mortem consciousness. So if you're curious about what might come next, what lies between the last breath, and what could be a new beginning, you're in the right place. Let's walk through this story together, one piece at a time, and see how hidden metaphysical truths and modern consciousness studies might be pointing us towards something extraordinary. The metaphysical foundations of a post-death transition. So why 49 days? Why not 7 or 90? It's a question that seems simple but opens the door to an entire world of spiritual and philosophical inquiry. In Tibetan Buddhism, this specific period represents the bardo state, a realm between death and rebirth. During these 49 days, consciousness is believed to undergo a journey, encountering various states of clarity, confusion, light, and shadow. The idea isn't just poetic, it's deeply systematic. The Tibetan Bardo teachings outline this transition as both a metaphysical process and a moral mirror, reflecting the life just lived and shaping what might come next. But this isn't merely an esoteric teaching isolated in one corner of the world. The concept of an intermediate zone, a liminal stage between lives, has echoed in many spiritual traditions. The number 49 itself, 7 cycles of 7 days, symbolizes transformation across multiple dimensions: physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual. In numerology, 7 is associated with introspection and spiritual awakening, and when multiplied, it becomes a sacred container for total transition. Here's where things get even more interesting. While ancient teachings talk about the soul's journey, modern metaphysics begins to ask whether consciousness can actually exist without the body. René Descartes, often credited as the father of modern Western philosophy, proposed a separation between mind and body, famously asserting cogito ergo sum, or I think, therefore I am. This declaration wasn't just about thought, it was about the immaterial nature of consciousness. He opened the philosophical floor to the idea that mind might not be anchored in flesh. This is where Robert Monroe's lesser-known yet remarkably influential book Far Journeys enters the scene. Monroe didn't theorize, he experimented. His work chronicled out-of-body experiences that suggested consciousness could operate independently of physical form. What he described feels uncannily similar to the Tibetan Bardo. Shifts in awareness, encounters with non-physical intelligences, and movements across unfamiliar realms. He didn't use the language of karma or rebirth, but the terrain he mapped out seems eerily familiar to anyone who has studied spiritual teachings about the afterlife. So the picture becomes more than symbolic. We're looking at recurring themes from vastly different traditions, ancient and modern, East and West, all pointing toward a transitional state beyond physical death. Could these 49 days represent more than just a mystical idea? Could they be part of a universal rhythm, a metaphysical law hiding in plain sight? The notion of a consciousness continuing past bodily death may sound controversial, but it's a question serious philosophers, researchers, and mystics have asked for centuries. And we're just getting started. Lessons from social spiritual psychology. Can consciousness really exist outside the brain? That question cuts right to the core of both psychological theory and spiritual exploration. While traditional neuroscience still tends to treat consciousness as a byproduct of neural activity, there's a growing chorus of voices challenging that assumption. And what's especially compelling is how this debate links to the idea of a transitional 49-day period after death, a time where awareness might still be active.
It is done.
Even though the body is not. Let's start with someone who stands at the intersection of science and spirituality, Sam Harris. Now, Harris is a skeptic by nature, yet even he acknowledges that consciousness is the one phenomenon we know for certain exists, even if we can't fully explain it. He often talks about the mysterious quality of awareness, especially in meditative states, and how subjective experience doesn't easily fit into our models of the brain. This opens the door to a broader question. If consciousness isn't fully explained by neurons firing, could it continue in some form after the brain shuts down? Carl Jung, on the other hand, pushed the idea even further. His concept of the collective unconscious suggested that parts of our psyche are not only shared across humanity, but also exist beyond the individual mind. If the unconscious stretches beyond the personal, then it's not a leap to consider that death might not erase awareness entirely, it might simply alter its shape. Jung saw dreams, symbols, and archetypes as glimpses into this collective field, possibly pointing to dimensions we access when the physical self falls away. These ideas resonate with near-death experiences, where people describe vivid journeys and encounters that can't be explained by standard psychological models. But let's not oversimplify. Mainstream psychology is still divided on these topics. While out-of-body and near-death experiences are documented, not all psychologists accept them as evidence of consciousness beyond death. Some see them as brain-induced hallucinations. That's a valid critique, and it's important to keep that balance. Yet it's worth noting that Tibetan Buddhist texts describe similar transitional experiences long before modern neurology existed. The alignment is hard to ignore. To add more texture to this conversation, let's bring in a lesser-known but deeply relevant book, Reincarnation, The Phoenix Fire Mystery, compiled by Sylvia Cranston and Carrie Williams. It collects cross-cultural perspectives on life after death, blending psychology, mysticism, and historical research. What's fascinating is how many of these accounts, whether from ancient India or 20th century Europe, describe an interval after death, where the soul or consciousness seems to retain memory, emotion, even moral reflection. It's not proof in a scientific sense, but it's compelling evidence that points toward a pattern. So, when you hear about the 49-day soul journey, remember it's not just a religious idea or an Eastern myth. It lives in the margins of modern psychology, in the stories people tell after coming back from the brink, and in the theories of those who dare to suggest that consciousness might stretch beyond the brain. Mazzy. Whether or not science fully agrees, the conversation is growing louder, and it's challenging everything we thought we knew about the mind, the soul, and what really happens when we die. Ancient philosophy and ethics bridging East and West. If consciousness does persist beyond the body, then the next big question is, does how we live affect where we go? This idea that morality influences